The Hells Angels biker followed the little girl to a locked pantry where a marked envelope threatened a forgotten life. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. The night was unusually quiet in the small town of Clearwater, the kind of silence that only comes before a storm. Jake Morrison, a Hells Angels biker with a reputation as cold as the leather jacket he wore, found himself on the outskirts of town, cruising down a desolate road. His Harley roared through the night, the headlights cutting through the dark like twin searchlights. But tonight, something was different. He felt an unfamiliar pull, like someone was watching him. That's when he saw her. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, standing by the side of the road. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her clothes were ragged, as though she'd been running for a long time. Jake's instincts kicked in. He pulled over, the engine growling to a halt as the sound echoed off the empty fields around them. "Hey there," he called, his voice gruff, but not unkind. "You all right?" The girl looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "I need your help," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're coming. You have to follow me." Jake was no stranger to danger, but there was something about her, something that made him trust her, despite the situation. He nodded, knowing this wasn't going to be an ordinary night. He followed the little girl down a narrow path, his boots crunching against the gravel, the cold night air biting at his face. She led him to a small, run-down house at the end of the lane, its windows boarded up and its porch light flickering. The house looked abandoned, but the girl didn't hesitate. She opened the door with a creak, and Jake followed her inside. The smell of old wood and dust filled the air, but it was the silence that hit him hardest. No sign of life. No sounds from within. Just the eerie quiet that seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog. The little girl led him into the kitchen, her small hand gripping the doorframe tightly. She stopped in front of a pantry, its door slightly ajar. "In there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jake stepped forward, pushing the door open. Inside, there was nothing but old jars and cans of food, but something caught his eye. A small envelope, marked with a symbol Jake recognized instantly. It was the same symbol he'd seen before, a reminder of a life he thought he'd left behind. As he reached for the envelope, the girl's eyes widened with fear. "Don't open it," she said urgently. But it was too late. Jake tore open the envelope, and inside was a letter, one that would change everything. It was addressed to him, in a handwriting he knew all too well, a name he hadn't heard in years. The letter was simple, but it was clear. The past wasn't done with him yet. And the girl? She wasn't just a lost child. She was a key to something much bigger, something dangerous. Jake's heart raced as he read the words, each one sinking into him like a stone in water. He had been marked, and the envelope was only the beginning. The letter in Jake's hand felt heavier than it should have, each word etched into his memory like a scar he thought had long healed. The envelope was meant for him, but how could this be? He had walked away from his past years ago, burying it as deep as he could. Yet, here it was, pulling him back into a world he thought he'd escaped. The little girl stood silently by the pantry door, her small frame tense with worry. Her eyes darted between the letter and Jake, as though the weight of the moment was pressing down on her too. Jake's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time, he saw the fear in her eyes was not just for herself. She was afraid of what this letter meant. "Who gave this to you?" Jake asked, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. The girl hesitated before speaking, her voice small. "I don't know. I found it hidden under the floorboards. It had your name on it." Jake's mind raced. The past, the secrets, everything he had tried to bury, had just come rushing back. He scanned the room quickly, his biker instincts kicking in. They weren't alone. He could feel it. Someone was watching them. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice firm now. "We can't stay here." He shoved the letter into his pocket and turned to face the girl. She looked up at him, wide-eyed and uncertain, but nodded slowly. The girl knew this wasn't just about a letter anymore. This was about something much darker, something dangerous. Jake moved quickly, grabbing her wrist gently, and led her out of the kitchen. The house creaked underfoot, each step making the air feel thicker. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling against the windows, rattling the glass as though nature itself was warning them. As Jake opened the door to leave, the sound of a motorcycle engine roared in the distance. His stomach tightened. The unmistakable sound of another biker, a familiar growl. But it wasn't the sound of a friend. It was the sound of someone coming for them. "We need to move faster," Jake muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the keys in his pocket. The girl stumbled as she followed him, her fear now more visible than ever. Jake could feel the weight of her hand in his, and something inside him told him she wasn't just an innocent bystander in this. She was connected to whatever storm was coming. As they reached the front yard, Jake paused, scanning the darkness. The storm had obscured everything around them, but he knew they weren't alone. "Get on the bike," Jake ordered. He didn't have time for questions. The girl hesitated for a moment, then climbed onto the back of his Harley, clutching him tightly. Jake started the engine, the powerful hum of the bike vibrating through his body as he kicked it into gear. The road stretched out before them, empty and lonely, but the sense of being hunted hung over them like a shadow. As they sped down the road, the wind whipping past them, Jake's thoughts were all over the place. The letter, the girl, the motorcycle following them, none of it made sense. But he knew one thing for sure. They were being pursued, and the only way to survive was to keep moving. Behind them, the roar of the other bike grew louder, and Jake could feel the heat of its pursuit. Whoever was following them wasn't going to let them go easily. He leaned into the turns, pushing the Harley faster, hoping to put distance between them and the threat. But the pursuit didn't stop. The other biker was relentless, closing the gap with every mile. Jake could hear the tires of the other bike screeching against the asphalt as it gained on them. "Hold on," Jake yelled over his shoulder to the girl. She squeezed her arms tighter around him, the terror in her grip telling Jake all he needed to know. The girl was scared, but she was also ready for whatever came next. The road ahead was dark, but Jake's mind was focused. There was no turning back now. The biker behind them was closing in, and Jake could see the headlights reflecting off the wet pavement, like two eyes locked on their every move. With a sharp turn, Jake shot the Harley onto a side road, hoping to lose the other rider in the maze of backstreets. He pushed the bike harder, the engine roaring louder as he leaned into the sharp curves. The girl held on, her breath shallow, but her grip tightening as the bike swerved through the streets. They couldn't outrun this forever. Jake needed a plan. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as the headlights of the pursuing biker disappeared for a moment. Had they lost them? He didn't dare slow down to find out. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, knowing that the next turn could be their last. The chase wasn't over yet, and Jake knew they needed to make it to safety before it was too late. The night was colder now, and Jake's grip on the handlebars tightened. The girl, still clinging to him tightly, didn't make a sound. He could feel her body pressed against his back, every jolt of the bike sending waves of tension through her. They had managed to lose the other rider for now, but Jake knew better than to think they were safe. The sound of the pursuit had vanished, but the silence felt wrong. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The storm had started to die down, but the night was still thick with the scent of wet earth and the low hum of his Harley's engine. He pushed the throttle, the bike responding with a deep growl, but he wasn't speeding for the thrill anymore. He was speeding because something was coming, and he had to outrun it. "We're going to stop soon," Jake said, his voice rough from the wind. "I'll find a place to lay low for a while." The girl didn't respond, but Jake could feel her body relax a little, as if she were trusting him more now. They had driven for what felt like hours, but in reality, it had only been about 45 minutes. Jake needed to find a way to get some answers. He needed to know who was after them, why the girl had brought him into this, and what the hell was in that letter. The house, the locked pantry, the envelope, it all felt like a puzzle, and Jake wasn't one to walk away from an unsolved puzzle. As they approached a small diner on the outskirts of a neighboring town, Jake eased the bike to a stop. The parking lot was empty except for a few rusted cars. He parked the Harley by the back, out of sight, and turned off the engine. "Stay close," Jake warned, as he dismounted. The girl slowly slid off the back of the bike, her small feet hitting the ground with a soft thud. She didn't say anything as she followed him to the entrance. Jake kept his eyes sharp, scanning the surrounding area, but there was no one in sight. He opened the door, the bell above the entrance ringing softly. Inside, the diner was nearly empty, with only a couple of older patrons seated at a booth in the far corner. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, looked up when they entered. She offered a small smile before her eyes drifted to the girl standing beside Jake. The girl looked back at her, her expression unreadable. "What can I get you?" the waitress asked, her voice kind but guarded. Jake slid onto a booth by the window, motioning for the girl to sit beside him. "Just a coffee," Jake replied, his tone still serious. "And whatever she wants," he added, glancing at the girl. The waitress nodded and turned to walk away, but Jake's eyes never left her. Something about this place felt off, like they were being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that the past was catching up to him, that this wasn't just some random stop. The waitress returned quickly with the drinks, setting the coffee in front of Jake and a small glass of water in front of the girl. Jake reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the letter, placing it on the table between them. The girl didn't look at it. Instead, she sipped her water slowly, her eyes glancing around the diner before returning to Jake. "You need to read it," she whispered. Jake frowned. "What's in it for you? Why are you mixed up in this?" The girl's eyes darkened, and she looked down at her hands, wringing them together nervously. "I don't know. I was just supposed to give it to you. I don't know why, but I don't want to be alone anymore." Jake sighed, his mind racing. He had no idea what was happening, but he couldn't ignore the girl's plea. He picked up the letter again and unfolded it, the words staring back at him. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the name on the letter, his own, and then the rest of it sank in. "This is impossible," he muttered under his breath. He had thought his past was buried, sealed away, but this letter was proof that it wasn't. The letter was a message, not just from his past, but for him, a message he couldn't ignore any longer. It spoke of unfinished business, of a debt that needed to be paid. And the girl? She was part of it. "We have to go," Jake said suddenly, standing up. He tucked the letter back into his jacket. The girl looked up at him, her face filled with confusion and fear. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Someone's coming," Jake replied, "and we need to be gone before they get here." He reached down and grabbed the girl's hand, pulling her toward the door. As they stepped outside, the wind had picked up again, the storm coming back with a vengeance. Jake squinted into the dark, his senses on high alert. The sound of another bike revving in the distance echoed through the empty streets. It was them, the ones who had been following them earlier. They had found them. The chase was far from over. The wind howled as Jake and the girl stepped out into the cold night, the storm intensifying once again. His heart was pounding in his chest, every sense on high alert. The sound of the motorcycle engine was growing louder, echoing down the empty street. He pulled the girl closer, feeling the urgency building within him. The letter, the girl, the dangerous people chasing them. It was all coming to a head. He needed to think fast. They had no time to waste. "We have to move, now," Jake muttered, glancing around for any sign of where the bike might be coming from. The girl's small hand was tightly gripping his jacket, her body shaking from fear. She had no idea who was after them or why they were being chased, but the terror was palpable in her every breath. Jake's eyes darted to the alley to his right. It was narrow, dark, and likely to be a dead end, but it was their only option. Without saying another word, he pulled her toward it, his boots slapping against the wet pavement. The alleyway was silent, but the roar of the approaching motorcycle told him they weren't alone anymore. The headlights were blinding now, cutting through the fog, closing in fast. Jake's mind raced. He had no choice but to find a place to hide. He spotted a rusted metal door halfway down the alley, almost hidden by shadows. It wasn't locked. Jake yanked it open, ushering the girl inside before quickly slipping in after her. The door shut with a heavy thud, sealing them in darkness. The only sound was their breathing, ragged and quick, as Jake tried to steady his nerves. "We'll wait here until they pass," he whispered to the girl, though he wasn't sure if it was more for her comfort or his own. The storm raged outside, the wind and rain pounding against the walls. For a moment, everything was still. The only thing that mattered was waiting for the threat to move on. But Jake knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. The sound of the motorcycle was still there, getting closer, too close for comfort. The girl's grip on Jake's arm tightened, and he could feel her trembling beside him. He wanted to reassure her, to tell her everything would be okay, but he couldn't make any promises. He had no idea what was happening, no idea why he was being dragged back into a life he thought was long behind him. The letter, the words it contained, kept repeating in his mind. A message from his past, something unfinished, something dangerous. And now, the girl, this innocent child, was caught up in it all. She was part of the puzzle, but he still didn't know how. Jake had no time to figure it out. The sound of the motorcycle had stopped. It was so close now, and Jake's breath caught in his chest. He could hear the engine idling, a sign that whoever it was knew they were close, knew they were hiding somewhere. Every instinct in Jake screamed at him to move, to do something, but he had no plan. He had no idea where to go or what to do. The girl's small voice broke through the tension. They're not going to stop until they find us, are they? Jake looked down at her, his jaw tightening. No, they won't. He didn't want to say it, but there was no use lying. The people chasing them wouldn't stop until they had whatever it was they were after. And now, Jake and the girl were at the center of it. The question was, how much longer could they keep running? Jake pressed his back against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. The bike was still there, waiting. It was only a matter of time before whoever was on it would make their move. Jake's mind raced through the possibilities, through the people he had left behind and the life he had tried to escape. This wasn't just some random chase. This was something much bigger. And the girl, the one who had somehow become part of it, was the key to everything. Jake didn't know what he was supposed to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let them take her. Not without a fight. He glanced around, looking for an escape, for any way out of the alley. The sound of the motorcycle revving broke through the silence, and Jake's stomach dropped. They were ready to move again. He didn't have much time. His mind raced for a plan, but there were only a few seconds left to act. We need to get out of here, Jake said, his voice low and urgent. He grabbed the girl's hand once more, pulling her toward the back of the building. Stay close. Don't look back. They ran, the sound of the motorcycle now growing faint behind them, but the threat still loomed. There was no running forever, but Jake would keep moving. He had to. For her. For himself. The road ahead might be dark, but it was the only road they had left. They ran through the back alley, Jake's boots pounding against the wet concrete, the sound of the girl's footsteps quick and light behind him. His heart was hammering in his chest, adrenaline pumping as he focused on getting them out of the immediate danger. The sound of the motorcycle's engine was growing distant, but Jake knew they couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. He glanced over his shoulder, just to be sure, but the street was still empty, the only sound the storm's roar and their rapid breathing. They reached the back of the building, where an old fire escape ladder clung to the side like a rusted relic. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. Climb, Jake ordered, his voice low but firm. The girl didn't hesitate. She grabbed the metal rungs, her small hands gripping tight as she started her climb. Jake followed close behind, his boots scraping against the ladder as he kept an eye on the alley below them. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to find somewhere safe, but he also knew the danger was closing in. They reached the rooftop, the wind whipping against them as they both took a moment to catch their breath. Jake looked around, scanning the area. The roof was high enough to give them some cover, but they couldn't stay here long. It wouldn't take long for whoever was following them to figure out where they'd gone. Stay low, Jake said, pulling the girl behind a ventilation unit on the roof. He crouched down beside her, trying to control his breathing. The girl, still shaken, was staring out into the distance. Why are they after us? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jake clenched his jaw. I don't know, he admitted, his mind racing. The letter, the chase, the girl's involvement, it didn't make sense. But one thing was clear. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted. And the girl? She was a part of it. A part of something much bigger than either of them could understand. The sound of a distant motorcycle engine made Jake's muscles tense. He slowly peeked around the corner of the building, eyes scanning the street below. Nothing. For now, they were safe. But he knew better than to relax. Not when the storm was still raging, not when the night had only just begun. We can't stay here, Jake muttered, standing up and pulling the girl to her feet. She didn't resist, but her face was pale, and her hands were trembling. Jake felt a surge of protectiveness. He wasn't sure why he was so determined to keep her safe, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this little girl was the key to something important. We need to get out of town, Jake said, Find somewhere no one will look for us. The girl looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. But where will we go? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake thought for a moment, his gaze lingering on the horizon. He didn't have a plan. Not really. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her face whatever was coming alone. We'll figure it out, he said, his voice firm. But we need to keep moving. Now. The two of them moved quickly across the roof, finding another access point leading down into a narrow alleyway. Jake motioned for the girl to stay close as they carefully made their way to the ground level. The streets were quiet now, but the sense of being hunted never left Jake. They had to stay one step ahead, always moving, always staying ahead of whatever danger was waiting for them. They reached a side street, a little more hidden from view. Jake's eyes darted around, looking for a place to blend in, a place to rest. We'll take a break here, Jake said, slowing his pace. He turned to the girl, who was still clinging to him. Her small body trembled with fear, but her eyes were focused. Are you okay? He asked, his voice softer now. She nodded slowly, but her lips trembled. I'm scared, she admitted. I don't know what's going on. Jake knelt down beside her, his expression softening. I know you are, he said quietly. But I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I promise. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with something more than fear. There was a flicker of hope, a flicker of trust. Jake felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He didn't know if he could protect her from whatever was coming, but he was sure as hell going to try. They stayed hidden in the side street for a while, the storm slowly easing up as the night dragged on. Jake kept his senses sharp, listening for any signs of movement, but the silence was almost deafening. After what felt like hours, Jake finally stood up. We can't stay here forever, he said, his voice steady. We need to get to the outskirts of town. There's an old motel I know, not far from here. We'll lay low for a while. The girl nodded, and they moved again, slipping through the darkened streets, always keeping to the shadows. They had no choice but to keep running, to keep moving. Because Jake knew that the danger wasn't just a chase, it was a countdown. And the clock was ticking. The cold wind had finally subsided, but the fear that had settled in Jake's chest felt like it would never leave. He and the girl walked quickly down the dimly lit street, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The streets were quiet now, but the silence was oppressive, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. Every step they took felt like a countdown, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't just chasing them, it was closing in. The old motel Jake had in mind was just ahead, tucked behind a line of trees that kept it hidden from the main road. He had stayed there before, years ago, when he needed to disappear. The place was a relic of a time long past, and it would be the perfect place to lie low. Almost there, Jake said, his voice low but steady as he glanced over at the girl. She had been quiet for a while, her face still pale with fear, but there was something in her eyes now, something that reminded him of himself, back when he was a kid, alone and lost. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake glanced down at her, his expression softening. I know you are, he said quietly. But we're going to be okay. Just stick with me, all right? She nodded, though her hand still shook slightly. Jake reached out and gave her a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder, then pushed open the door to the motel. The bell above the door rang, and the smell of stale coffee and old carpet hit them immediately. The clerk behind the counter looked up as they entered, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in Jake's worn appearance and the girl beside him. You looking for a room? The clerk asked, his voice gruff. Yeah, Jake replied. Just for the night. The clerk eyed them for a moment longer, then grabbed a key off the rack. Room 6. It's at the end of the hall, he said, sliding the key across the counter. Jake nodded and took the key, not bothering to make small talk. They didn't have time for that. He turned to the girl, gesturing for her to follow him. The hall was empty, the floors creaking under their feet as they made their way down to the room. Jake unlocked the door and stepped inside, flicking on the light. The room was small and dingy, with a single bed covered in a faded floral comforter. There was a small television in the corner, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Jake closed the door behind them and locked it. Stay here, he told the girl. I'm going to check around, make sure no one followed us. She nodded, sitting down on the edge of the bed, her eyes glued to the floor. Jake gave her a quick glance before heading for the window. He pulled the blinds back just enough to peer outside. The parking lot was empty, but that didn't mean they were safe. He knew better than to trust silence. The bike that had been following them was probably still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment to strike. He looked around the room one more time, checking every corner, every possible exit. It wasn't much of a place to hide, but it would have to do for now. He went into the bathroom and checked the small window, making sure it was locked. Then, he returned to the girl, who was still sitting on the bed, her eyes wide and filled with fear. "We're safe for now," he said, sitting down beside her. "But we need to keep moving tomorrow. We can't stay here long." The girl nodded, her hands clutching the comforter tightly. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are they after us?" Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But we'll figure it out. Just trust me, all right?" The girl didn't answer at first, but she looked up at him, her gaze searching. Finally, she nodded. "I trust you," she said quietly. Jake wasn't sure why she trusted him. He didn't trust anyone anymore. But he couldn't help feeling a flicker of hope, a small spark that maybe, just maybe, he could protect her from whatever was coming. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the weight of the night pressing down on them. Jake's mind was racing. The letter, the motorcycle, the people chasing them. Nothing made sense. But he knew they didn't have much time. They couldn't hide here forever. Whoever was after them would come looking again. The question was, what would they find when they did? Jake stood up, running his hand over his face. "I'll be back soon," he said, more to himself than to the girl. "Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone." He turned to leave, but before he could reach the door, the girl called out to him. "Jake!" He paused, turning back to face her. She was standing now, her small form trembling slightly. "Are you sure we're going to be okay?" she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. Jake looked at her for a long moment, then gave her a small nod. "Yeah," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're going to be all right." But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if he believed it. The road ahead was uncertain, and the dangers were only getting worse. But there was one thing Jake knew for sure. He wasn't going to let anyone take her without a fight. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. The night had grown eerily quiet, and Jake's eyes darted around the small motel room, scanning for any sign of danger. The girl was still sitting on the bed, her legs pulled up to her chest as she hugged her knees. Her expression was distant, her mind clearly racing with questions she couldn't voice. Jake didn't have the answers, but he knew. They couldn't stay here much longer. Whoever was after them would eventually figure out where they'd gone. It was only a matter of time. He walked over to the window and peeked through the blinds, eyes scanning the parking lot. Empty. For now, at least. The sound of his own breathing felt loud in the stillness of the room. He turned back to the girl. "I'm going out for a while," Jake said, his voice low. "Stay here, and don't open the door for anyone." "Got it." She nodded, though her face remained troubled. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "why are they after us? What do they want?" Jake felt the weight of her question press down on him, but he couldn't give her an answer. "Not yet. I don't know," he replied, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "But I'll find out. Just stay here and keep your head down." He grabbed his jacket and slipped out the door, locking it behind him. The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped into the street, the familiar hum of the city surrounding him. It felt like a lifetime ago that he had walked these streets, but now they seemed foreign, dangerous. The weight of the letter in his jacket pocket reminded him of what he had left behind, and what he was being dragged back into. He didn't want to be involved in whatever this was. He didn't want to drag the girl into it either. But something about her, something about the way she had shown up in his life, made him believe she was the key to it all. He had to find out who was behind this, who wanted them dead, and why. Jake walked for a few blocks, keeping to the shadows, blending in with the quiet night. He wasn't sure where he was headed, but he knew he had to meet someone. He had to get information. The first stop was a bar on the edge of town, a place he used to frequent when he needed answers, before he had walked away from his past. He entered through the back door, as he always did, and slipped into the dimly lit interior. The bar was empty except for a few regulars hunched over their drinks. Behind the counter stood an old bartender, his face weathered from years of service, his eyes sharp despite his age. Jake approached him, his boots clicking softly on the floor. "You seen anyone hanging around here lately?" Jake asked, his voice low. The bartender glanced up, his eyes narrowing. Depends on who you mean, he said, wiping down a glass with a cloth. Jake leaned in closer. I'm looking for someone. Tall guy, dark hair, leather jacket. You know the type. The bartender paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned in as well, his voice barely above a whisper. You better stay away from that crowd, boy. You don't want to get involved with them. They've got connections, big ones. Jake's stomach twisted. Who are they? He pressed. Hell's Angels, the bartender muttered, his voice a mix of fear and respect. Jake's heart skipped a beat. The Hell's Angels? It was a name he hadn't heard in years, not since he'd left them behind. But it made sense. The letter, the pursuit, the people after him and the girl. This was bigger than just a random chase. This was personal. Where can I find them? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the surge of anger building inside him. The bartender shook his head. You're asking the wrong guy. But if you really want to find them, head to the old warehouse on 3rd Street. You'll get answers there, one way or another. Jake didn't hesitate. He slid a few bills across the counter, nodding in thanks. He turned to leave, but before he could make it out the door, the bartender's voice stopped him. Be careful, kid. They don't forget. And they don't forgive. Jake didn't respond. He just stepped back into the night, his mind racing. The warehouse on 3rd Street. That's where he would find the answers. He had no choice now. He had to face the past. He walked with purpose, his mind already working through the possibilities. The girl, the letter, the people chasing them. All of it was tied to the Hell's Angels, to the life he had once known. But what did they want? And why were they after him now? As Jake reached 3rd Street, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. The warehouse loomed ahead, its dark silhouette cutting into the night sky. It was quiet here, too quiet. But Jake wasn't fool enough to think he would be left alone for long. He approached the building cautiously, his hand resting on the gun in his jacket. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew he couldn't back down now, not with the girl's life on the line. He slipped through a side door and into the shadows, the sound of his boots barely making a sound on the concrete floor. The warehouse was massive, the air thick with dust and the smell of oil and rust. He moved silently, his senses alert to every creak and whisper in the dark. The moment he stepped deeper into the warehouse, the lights flickered on, revealing a group of men standing in the center. Their eyes locked onto him, their faces cold and unreadable. Jake's grip tightened around the handle of his gun. He knew he was walking into a storm, and there was no turning back. The lights flickered to full brightness, casting harsh shadows on the walls of the warehouse. Jake's hand tightened around the gun in his jacket as the men before him shifted slightly, their eyes not just cold but calculating. There were at least 6 of them, all dressed in leather, their patches glinting in the fluorescent light. These were not just bikers. They were part of the Hell's Angels crew, the same crew Jake had once belonged to. He took a slow, steady breath, trying to keep his composure. His mind raced, but his body remained still, a learned instinct from years of surviving the streets. A tall man in front stepped forward. His face was scarred, and the deep lines around his eyes suggested a man who had seen more than his fair share of violence. He had the aura of someone in charge. Jake Morrison, the man said, his voice low and gravelly. I thought you were dead. Jake didn't flinch. Not dead, he replied, his voice steady. Just disappeared. The man's lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Funny. You think you can just leave the club and walk away clean? You should know better. Jake's fingers twitched on the grip of the gun. I'm not here to relive the past, he said, keeping his voice even. I'm here for answers. The tall man raised an eyebrow, glancing at the others. One of the bikers stepped forward, clearly itching for a fight, but the leader raised a hand, stopping him. Answers? The leader's voice was laced with sarcasm. You think we're just going to hand over answers to a traitor? Jake's jaw clenched. I didn't leave the club because I wanted to. I left because I had no choice. He took a step closer, his eyes locking with the leader's. And now I'm back because something's going on. People are chasing me, chasing her, he said, nodding toward the girl he had left back at the motel. And I need to know why. The leader's expression hardened at the mention of the girl, his eyes narrowing. You're dragging her into this? The air in the room grew thick, as if the very walls were pressing in. She's not a part of this, Jake said, his voice cutting through the tension. But whoever's after us, They think she is. And that makes it personal. The tall man didn't respond immediately, his gaze lingering on Jake. Then, after a long, tense silence, he spoke again, this time with a tone that was more dangerous than before. You've been gone for too long, Jake. You think you can just show up and play hero? You're in way over your head. Jake's mind raced as the men circled around him. He could feel their hostility, like a tangible weight in the room. But there was no backing down now. He wasn't just here for answers anymore. He was here to make sure that whatever was happening didn't drag him back into a life he had fought so hard to escape. I'm not here for the club, Jake said, his voice cold now. I'm here to find out who's after me, and after her. The leader's eyes flicked to the others, and then he gave a small nod. Maybe you're not totally out of your mind, he muttered. All right, Morrison. If you really want answers, then you're going to have to prove it. Jake felt a surge of frustration, but he kept his face neutral. Prove what? He asked, his voice sharp. That you're not just some washed-up ex-biker who thinks he can walk back into this world and call the shots. You want to get to the bottom of this. You need to prove your loyalty again. The tension in the room thickened, the weight of the unspoken challenge hanging heavily in the air. Jake took a deep breath. He had no interest in proving anything to these people, but he knew he had no choice. What do you want me to do? He asked, his tone resigned. The leader smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant smile. There's a shipment coming in tonight. A few crates of goods we don't want anyone to know about. If you can get your hands on those crates and bring them back to me, maybe we'll talk about the answers you're looking for. Jake's stomach tightened. He didn't like this, didn't like being pushed back into the club's business. But the alternative was worse. If he didn't comply, they would make his life hell, and he would never get any closer to finding out who was after them. Fine, Jake said, his voice tight. Where's the shipment? The leader looked at him, his eyes cold. You'll get the address when we're done here. But you need to remember something, Morrison. If you mess this up, if you step out of line, there's no coming back. Not for you, not for her. The weight of the threat hung in the air, and Jake knew that if he didn't pull this off, there would be no second chances. The man nodded again, and the bikers around him seemed to relax slightly. Jake stood there, his mind spinning with thoughts of what he had just agreed to. He had no intention of doing this for the club, but he was running out of options. All right, Jake said, his voice steady. I'll get it done. With that, the leader turned, signaling the others to follow him. Jake was left standing there, alone in the dark, with a new task ahead of him. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when the answers were so close. He turned, heading for the exit. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The night was far from over, and Jake could feel the weight of the task ahead of him pressing down on him with every step. He had just agreed to something he didn't fully understand, but the stakes were too high. He had to find out who was behind all of this, why they were after him and the girl, and what the Hell's Angels were involved in now. The address they had given him was on the outskirts of town, an old warehouse by the docks, one that he knew well from his past. The air was thick with the smell of salt and oil as Jake approached the area, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows on the ground. He could hear the distant sound of water lapping against the docks, but otherwise, it was eerily quiet. Jake's hand instinctively went to the gun hidden in his jacket, a reminder that he wasn't just walking into a simple meeting. This was a setup, and he knew it. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. As he reached the entrance of the warehouse, he took a deep breath, steeling himself. This place had been a part of his past, a place where deals were made in the dark and favors were paid in blood. He didn't want to be back here, but there was no other choice. He pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the floor covered in dust and oil stains. In the center of the room, a few crates were stacked, and Jake could make out the shape of a few men standing around them. The leader from earlier was there, along with the rest of his crew, their eyes trained on Jake as he stepped inside. You're late, the leader said, his voice cool and mocking. Jake didn't respond, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. Where's the shipment? Jake asked, his voice steady. The leader gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and one of the men stepped forward, unlocking one of the crates. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the warehouse. As the crate opened, Jake's heart skipped a beat. Inside were stacks of cash, bundles of bills wrapped tightly in plastic. But it wasn't the money that caught his attention. It was the papers beneath the cache, a file folder that had the same symbol from the letter. Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just a shipment. It was evidence of something far bigger. What's in the folder? Jake asked, his voice low. The leader's eyes gleamed with amusement. That's none of your business, he said, stepping forward. You just do your part, and we'll all walk away from this. Jake didn't back down. He stepped closer to the crate, his eyes never leaving the folder. I didn't come here to make deals, Jake said, his voice hardening. I came here to get answers. The leader's smile faltered, but only for a second. You think you can just walk in here and demand answers? He sneered. You left us. You're not one of us anymore. Jake's jaw clenched. He had left. But that didn't mean he was going to let this go. He had unfinished business, and the girl's life was on the line. I don't care about your club, Jake said, stepping even closer. I care about getting the truth. So start talking. The leader's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jake thought he saw something like hesitation in his gaze. But then the moment passed, and the leader laughed, a low, mocking sound that echoed through the warehouse. All right, Morrison. You want the truth? You're too late. Jake's stomach churned. What do you mean? He asked, his voice low. The leader stepped back, his expression hardening. This isn't just about you. Or her. It's bigger than that. This whole thing, the money, the power, it's all part of something much darker. And you're not ready for it. Jake's fists clenched at his sides. I'm done with the games. Tell me what's really going on. The leader shook his head slowly, a bitter smile on his lips. You still don't get it, do you? You think you can just waltz back in and get answers like it's that easy. You're in the middle of something much bigger than your little retirement. You can't outrun it. Jake took a step forward, his eyes burning with determination. I'm not running anymore. I'm here to end this. The leader studied him for a moment, then turned to the men around him. Let's show him, he said, his voice low. One of the bikers stepped forward, pulling a gun from his belt and aiming it at Jake. Jake's hand immediately went to his own weapon, but before he could react, the leader stopped him. Not yet, he said. You want answers? You're going to have to earn them. Jake's heart raced. What do you want from me? The leader's smile was cold. Prove your loyalty. Do what you did before. Show us you're still one of us. Only then will we tell you everything. Jake stood there, his mind racing. He didn't want to be a part of this world again. He didn't want to play by their rules. But the girl's life was still at stake, and he knew he couldn't walk away now. All right, Jake said, his voice hardening. I'll do it. The leader's smile widened. Good. I knew you'd come around. The air in the warehouse felt charged, like the calm before a storm. Jake knew this was only the beginning. He had no choice but to play their game, at least for now. But once he had the answers he needed, he wasn't going to stop until this was over. No matter what it took. The warehouse was thick with tension as Jake stood in front of the men, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. The leader's cold, calculating smile hadn't wavered, but Jake could feel the weight of the unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Prove his loyalty. That's what they wanted. But how could he prove anything to a group of people he had left behind? He had walked away from the Hells Angels years ago, and yet, here he was, caught up in a dangerous game again, with no real choice but to play along. The leader motioned for Jake to follow. You want to get to the bottom of this? Show us you're still one of us. Do the job like you used to. One of the bikers moved to the side, revealing a heavy-duty van parked at the far end of the warehouse, its back doors open. Inside were several large crates marked with the same symbol as the one on the letter. The leader glanced at Jake, his eyes glinting with something between amusement and threat. Take them to the drop point. No questions. And don't try anything funny. Jake's gaze flicked to the crates, his stomach twisting. He wasn't interested in running errands for these people, but he knew he couldn't walk away from this without learning what he needed to know. Not with the girl's life on the line. All right, Jake said, his voice steady. I'll do it. The leader nodded, clearly pleased. Good. I knew you'd come around. Jake's eyes narrowed. He had to play along, but his mind was already calculating his next move. He didn't trust any of them. They could give him the answers he was looking for, or they could set him up. Either way, he was getting out of this warehouse with the truth. And he wasn't going to let them keep him in the dark for long. He walked toward the van, the sound of his boots echoing in the vast space of the warehouse. The crates were heavy, their weight a constant reminder of the danger they represented. He could hear the leader's voice calling after him, but he kept his focus on the task at hand. As he approached the van, the biker who had been standing guard stepped forward. What's in the crates? Jake asked, trying to keep his voice casual. The biker smirked. Does it matter? You do your part, we do ours. Simple as that. Jake clenched his jaw, but didn't press further. He was already in too deep. The van doors slammed shut behind him as he climbed inside. As the engine roared to life, Jake stole a glance at the rearview mirror, watching the warehouse recede into the distance. His mind was racing. What was in those crates? Why were they so important? And more importantly, who was behind this operation? The van sped through the streets, the night swallowing them whole as the city lights flickered past. The road ahead was unclear, but Jake's gut told him they were heading into dangerous territory. He checked his watch. He didn't have much time. The girl was still back at the motel, waiting for him. He needed to get back to her as soon as possible, but he couldn't leave without answers. The van turned onto a desolate road, surrounded by thick trees and darkness. It was the perfect place for a secret meeting, away from prying eyes. The van slowed as they neared an old building, its windows boarded up and the sign hanging crookedly above the door. A small group of men stood outside, waiting. Jake's heart beat faster. This was it. He didn't know what was going to happen next, but he knew this was where things were going to get even more complicated. The van stopped, and Jake climbed out, the tension in his chest growing with each step. The men outside watched him closely as he approached, their eyes scanning him for any sign of resistance. One of them stepped forward, a tall, imposing figure with a scar running down his face. "You got the goods?" he asked, his voice rough. Jake nodded, though his mind was still running through the possibilities. This was the moment that would determine everything. "Yeah," Jake replied, "but I want answers first. Who's behind this? Why are they after me?" The man smirked, but his eyes remained cold. "You'll get your answers. But first, we deal with business." The man motioned for Jake to follow, and the rest of the group moved aside to make way for him. As they walked toward the door, Jake's heart raced. He had no idea what was inside this building or what kind of operation they were running, but he was about to find out. They entered the building, the air thick with the smell of smoke and stale air. The room was dimly lit, with a large table in the center, surrounded by chairs. At the table sat two men, their faces hidden in the shadows. Jake's senses were on high alert. "Put the crates down," one of the men said, his voice gravelly. Jake did as he was told, keeping his distance from the table. The two men looked at the crates, then back at Jake. "You're looking for answers, huh?" one of them asked, leaning forward. "Well, you're in the right place. But it's going to cost you." Thick as Jake stood his ground, his hand brushing the gun inside his jacket. The two men at the table stared at him, their expressions hardening with each passing second. The tension was palpable, and Jake knew he couldn't let them push him around. He had a mission, a purpose, and he was getting his answers, no matter the cost. "You're out of your league, Jake." The man at the table spoke again, his voice low but sharp. "You think you can walk in here and demand answers? After everything you've done, after everything we've built? You're nothing to us now." Jake's mind raced, processing every word. They weren't just holding answers from him. They were holding power, leverage. This wasn't just about the girl or the letter anymore. This was about control, a game they had been playing for much longer than he had realized. The other man at the table, silent until now, spoke up. "You're looking for answers, but you don't understand the stakes. It's not just about you anymore. It's about all of us. The club, the deals we've made, the power we hold." Jake's heart tightened at the mention of the club. He had thought he left all of this behind, but he was still tangled in the web they had spun. "What are you saying?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You're already part of this. You always were. You think you can leave it behind? You can't. Not when you've seen what's really going on. The world we've built. Jake, you're just a small piece of it." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He had thought he was running from it all, but the truth was, he was already in too deep. The club's influence, the deals they made, the people they controlled, it was all part of something bigger than him, something he couldn't just walk away from. He had no choice but to face it now. "You want me to join you?" Jake asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and anger. "You want me back in your fold?" The man's eyes flickered with something close to amusement. "No, we don't need you to join us. We need you to prove you're still one of us. You're not just some outsider. You're connected to everything we've built. You can't escape it." The weight of the words sank in. Jake wasn't just a former member of the Hells Angels. He was a part of the very machine that had kept the club running for years. He had helped build it, helped solidify the power they held, even if he hadn't realized the full extent of it back then. The truth was, he was still a piece of the puzzle, whether he liked it or not. "And if I don't?" Jake asked, his voice now cold, his grip tightening on the gun in his jacket. The leader's smile faltered, but only slightly. "If you don't," he said, his voice low, "we'll make sure you never get the answers you're looking for. We'll make sure you regret it." Jake's mind raced, but he kept his expression neutral. He couldn't let them see that he was rattled. The stakes were higher than he had realized. The girl, the letter, the Hells Angels, everything was connected, and now, he had to figure out how to get out of it without losing everything. The leader leaned back in his chair, watching Jake closely. "The job's simple. Take the goods to the drop-off point. No questions. Then we'll talk." Jake's eyes flicked to the crates by the door. The job. It was still a part of their game, still a test to see if he could play along. But Jake wasn't just going to play their game anymore. He needed to turn the tables. He couldn't trust them. Not with his life. Not with the girl's life. Jake nodded slowly. "Fine," he said. "I'll do the job. But I'm not doing it for you." The leader raised an eyebrow. "Then why?" Jake's voice was steady as he spoke, the words coming out with a quiet resolve. "I'm doing it because I need the answers. And I'll get them, one way or another." The leader's eyes narrowed, studying him, trying to gauge whether Jake was bluffing or if he truly meant it. After a long pause, he gave a slight nod. "We'll see about that." Jake turned and walked toward the crates, his mind already planning his next move. The men around him watched with suspicion, but Jake didn't care. He was already in motion. This wasn't just about delivering a shipment. It was about getting to the truth. He grabbed the crates and carried them toward the door. As he stepped out of the warehouse, the cool night air hit him like a slap. The world outside was still, but Jake knew the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. He didn't have much time. He had to keep moving. The drop-off point was nearby, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized how dangerous this all was. The Hells Angels weren't just a gang. They were a well-oiled machine, and Jake was stuck in the middle of it. The girl, the letter, the shipment, it was all part of a much larger game, one that Jake didn't fully understand yet. But he was about to find out. He climbed into the van and started the engine, the sound of the motor filling the quiet night. The road stretched out before him, dark and empty, but Jake could feel the weight of what was coming. He had to deliver the crates. He had to get the answers. And no matter what, he wasn't going to let them control him any longer. The engine of the van hummed steadily as Jake navigated the dark, empty roads. The city's lights faded behind him, and the vast, open expanse of the outskirts stretched before him. The cold air that slipped through the cracked window felt like a reminder of how far he'd drifted from the life he had tried to leave behind. He had no idea where this road was taking him, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he became. This wasn't just another job. This was the final test, the point of no return. The crates in the back of the van weighed heavy on his mind, but it was the folder inside them that consumed his thoughts. The symbol on the crate, the symbol on the letter. Whoever was behind all this was playing a game he didn't fully understand, and the only way out was to finish what he started. He hadn't wanted to get back into the Hells Angels world, but the deeper he dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about bikers or old grudges. This was about power. And the girl, she was somehow central to all of it. Jake knew the road to the drop-off point would take him past more than just dangerous bikers. He was walking into a storm, and if he didn't get the answers he needed, everything he had fought for, the life he had tried to rebuild, would come crashing down. As he approached the drop-off point, a dilapidated warehouse sat like a beast waiting in the shadows. It looked abandoned, but Jake knew better. This was where they wanted him to bring the shipment. This was where he would either sink or swim. The van slowed as he neared the building, and Jake's grip on the steering wheel tightened. The headlights of the van illuminated the massive metal doors at the front of the warehouse, casting long, stretching shadows on the ground. He parked the van as far from the entrance as he could, trying to remain inconspicuous. He wasn't sure who was waiting inside, but he knew this was no place for mistakes. He needed to be ready for anything. He grabbed the crates from the back of the van, the heavy weight of them making his shoulders ache as he walked toward the entrance. Every step echoed in the silence, reminding him that he was alone in this. No one could help him now, He didn't know who had orchestrated all of this, but he knew he had to finish it before it consumed him completely. As he reached the door, he paused, his senses on high alert. He could feel the eyes watching him even before he stepped inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound too loud in the stillness of the night. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of oil and decay. Shadows clung to the corners, and Jake's boots clattered on the concrete floor as he walked further into the building. He could make out the shapes of several men standing near the back, their faces obscured in the dim light. "You brought it," a voice called out from the darkness. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had expected to find the leader here, but the voice sounded different, more distant, colder. The men stepped forward, and Jake recognized them as members of the Hells Angels crew. They were a little too eager, a little too sharp-eyed. It was clear that this wasn't just a simple exchange. "Put it down," the voice said again, and Jake complied, setting the crates on the ground. "Where's the rest?" one of the men asked, his eyes scanning the crates as if expecting more than just money. Jake clenched his jaw. "This is all I was given. No more." The man raised an eyebrow, clearly not pleased with the answer. "That's not what we were promised." Jake's mind raced. He had no idea what they were expecting, but it was clear they were waiting for something else, something more. "I'm not here to play games," Jake said, his voice low and dangerous. "I did what you asked. Now I want my answers." The man stepped closer, his hand resting on the handle of a knife at his belt. "You think you can come back after all these years and demand answers?" he sneered. "You don't get to make the rules anymore, Jake. You're not one of us." Jake stood his ground, the anger in his chest rising. "I'm not here to join you. I'm here to get answers about the girl. Why is she involved in all of this?" The men exchanged looks, and for the first time, Jake saw something flicker in their eyes. They were keeping something from him, something important. "You've really got no idea, do you?" The voice spoke again, but this time it was closer. The figure stepped into the light, and Jake's breath caught. It was the leader, the one who had sent him on this mission. "You want the truth?" the leader asked, his voice cold. "The girl is part of something much bigger than you ever realized. She's been groomed for this from the start, and now you're right in the middle of it." Jake's mind reeled. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. The leader smiled, a slow, menacing grin that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "You've been playing the part of the hero, Jake. But you're a pawn in all of this, just like the rest of us." The words hit Jake like a slap in the face, but before he could respond, the leader motioned to the men behind him. "We'll tell you everything. But first, you need to prove your loyalty once again." The room seemed to close in on him as the leader's words sank in. Jake had no choice now. He was trapped in a game that was far beyond him. And the only way out was to play along, at least for now. The truth was close, but it was going to cost him everything. Discover the thrilling world of Hell Angels. Stories where powerful bikers face life-altering decisions in their dangerous journeys. In this intense tale, a Hells Angels biker finds himself at a crossroads, torn between loyalty and doing what's right when he encounters an unexpected situation. The challenges ahead are not just physical, but emotional, testing the strength of his resolve as he delves deeper into a world filled with secrets, dangers, and redemption. Hell Angel stories are packed with emotional depth, high-stakes action, and an exploration of humanity's darkest and brightest moments. Join the biker as he uncovers a hidden truth that will change everything, with consequences that no one saw coming. This story, like so many other Hell Angel stories, is a powerful testament to the idea that even the toughest can be shaken by vulnerability. Experience the story of a Hells Angels member who discovers more than just a hidden past, but a path toward redemption. This Hell Angels story will leave you questioning what you know about loyalty, family, and the meaning of protection. With each twist, the biker's journey grows more complex, revealing that the world of Hell's Angels holds more secrets than anyone could have imagined.